Chapter 6. At first, things didn't go nicely, and he would look back later and wonder at the timing and the way life worked. It was spring, with 2 months of school left. School became difficult for Brian. Everybody knew about the fight. Some thought he was a hero and some thought he was crazy. And most kept away from him. He ran into Carl Lammers now and then in the hallway, and Lammers stayed well clear of him. Susan decided Brian was just exactly the right person in the whole world for her and made an effort to be near him whenever she could, walk with him whenever she could, talk to him whenever she could. He knew she was a good person, but she was very popular, a member of all the clubs who did all the activities, and she was always trying to draw Brian out, to make him talk about himself. Finally, he began to avoid her in as nice as a manner as possible, but word went around that he was stuck up, and soon Susan and everybody else left him alone. Though he liked the solitude, oddly it made him feel bad and made going to classes difficult. He had began to hate school and went only because he had to. He studied out of habit, and strangely his grades stayed up. Months later, he thought that he would have gone crazy except for Caleb in the dream. The dream came when he was awake, in school, at home with his mother. Whenever there was a moment of quiet or boredom, his thoughts would glaze over and the dream would come. It was a dream of getting ready, always that, getting ready. Ready to go back, ready to go home. To go home to the woods and find he didn't know what. To find himself and sometimes something about himself. Often the dream would be about what he would take. The kind of weapon, always a bow, never a gun. The kind of arrows, fishing equipment, clothing. Not just to go back and survive this time, but to live and to be happy where he lived. Just to be. The right kind of equipment, his canoe. A good bow, several dozen good arrows, the right pair of snowshoes, some hooks and line, a good sleeping bag, tarp to make a shelter, maybe a tent, a pot to cook in. No, 2 pots, one big and one medium, clothes for fall and winter, good boots, moccasins. He worked the list endlessly in his mind, improving it, changing it, and finally writing it down on the list. He carried it in a notebook wherever he went, making changes as they came to him. Nothing each detail of each item. I have become truly anal, he thought once when he had changed the kind of arrowheads from the fancy new razor heads to the old-fashioned MA3s, 3-bladed Army-issue arrowheads that needed sharpening but were so strong you could hit a rock without hurting them. But it was more than just being picky. In the end, he was keeping his sanity, arranging his life. At first, the list was the guide from the dream to reality, but when he had perfected the list, he started to gather the items on it, ordering from catalogs in the backs of hunting and fishing magazines. His mother knew he was ordering, but she was involved in other things and left him mostly to himself. And as he received items, he put them in his room, and she didn't question him. The first thing to come was a bow. He did not want to get too complicated and stay away from the compound bows with wheels and pulleys. They were more accurate, maybe, and far easier to pull, but he sensed they would break with rough use. Instead, he wrote to Blakely, a man who made long bows and shorter recurve bows, and ordered what Blakely called a short long bow. True long bows were fine but very long, as the name implied, and Brian knew that in a brush they would hang up on branches and be hard to use. He ordered a shorter version with 45-pound pull at 26 inches. He hadn't been sure of the pull weight, but he told Blakely his size and what he wanted to use for general hunting, and Blakely told him to keep it low. Blakely made bows with up to 120 pounds pull, but they were brutal, and he wrote, "If the arrowhead is sharp, it will penetrate from a softer bow as well as a hard one." The bow was beautiful, a mix of ironwood and rosewood, laminated in thin strips with fiberglass on the front and back. Blakely included 4 extra strings. He also sold arrows, so Brian bought 100 Port Orford cedar shafts and all the tools and precant, feathers, and ox he would need to make his own arrows. Blakely also sent along 50 of the MA3 broadheads and field points for the arrows so he could practice without using the MA3s. Brian had never made arrows before, but there were full instructions with the equipment, and Brian found it easy to do. He went to a garden store and brought home 3 hay bales. He put them in the backyard and put a cardboard target in front. When he had 6 arrows finished and started shooting each day, it was incredible. He was used to weapons he'd made with the crude arrows and fire-hardened points, and he was amazed at the difference. The bow was smooth and clean and quiet, and the arrows flew with a tight accuracy that at first he couldn't believe. On the first day, he had several shots where he actually hit one arrow with another in the center of the cardboard target. To protect his fingers, he used a simple leather tab that Blakely had thrown in, and he must have shot 200 times the first day. He didn't use sights, but shot by instinct. Let his mind and eye feel where the arrow would go, as he'd done with his war bow in the woods. And within a week, he could consistently hit a 6-inch circle in the cardboard from 20 yards. Just this one part of the list, the bow and arrows, took 2.5 weeks, not counting the time for shipping. The work gave him something to do, kept him active. Along with the list and practice, he had Caleb. 5 days a week, he went to Caleb's house after school. His mother thought it was for counseling, though she wondered that no bills came. In a way, it was true. Counseling was a matter of telling somebody something and getting help with a problem. And that was what he was doing with Caleb. He told Caleb about his life in the woods, and though Caleb seldom said much, this talking helped Brian to understand himself and what was happening, and what was going to happen to him. Caleb would make a pot of tea, nothing fancy, just hot water in a tea bag with some cream and sugar, and have a cup waiting where Brian got there. Brian had never thought much of tea, but the first time he put sugar in it and sipped it while he spoke, it somehow seemed to always have been a part of him. It was so natural that after only a small bit of thought, he added tea to his list for the woods, tea and sugar in cubes. He would take the tea, sit down in the iron chair, look at Caleb and say, "What do you want to hear about today?" I wouldn't even know what to ask. You pick it. And Brian would think a moment and then tell a story of moose or fishing or the sun on the water or the way beaver built a house or the lonely cry of a loon in the night or the stomach-tightening wail of a wolf singing to the moon. And Caleb would listen quietly, his eyes staring off, sometimes crying or laughing, sometimes surprised, sometimes sad. Then there came a day when school was nearly done, when Brian had received nearly all the things on his list, and Caleb sighed and said, "It's time for you to go back, to find what you're looking for." Brian agreed. They'd spoken about this going back and how he had to know what it was that pulled him and made him feel empty. "But I don't know exactly how to do it," Brian said. "I'll help you." "You will?" Caleb shrugged. "I'm supposed to be helping you recover your mental health, aren't I?" "Well, it's clear that for you to be mentally healthy, you have to go back to the woods and find what you left there." "That's true. What about the Cree family who rescued you? The trappers?" The Smallhorns, Brian thought of them often. "What about them? Didn't they want you to come back and visit them?" Brian stared. "Of course. It's perfect. Why didn't I think of that?"